you enjoy this. So Jim and I had a kind of a conversation about kind of a couple of different topics, and we kind of eventually settled on, we had talked about camouflage, because camouflage is an amazing thing in and of itself, but then we wanted, I guess, if you're an Audubon society, it does make perfect sense to connect them with birds. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to go through, I mean, some of these birds I'm sure will be familiar, some maybe not. And then at the end, I have a few slides that are sort of a find the bird sort of thing. And because it is pretty amazing. But the title slide here, not only to honor the Francis M. Weston Audubon Society, and thank you again very much for having me. It's an honor to be here this evening. Actually, it'd be an honor to be in Pensacola, but it's really an honor to be with you virtually. So thank you very much for having me. And then this American bittern is a very good example. It's a bird I would imagine that at least some of you have seen before, but they're for a big sort of bulky heron, they don't have any of the elegance like of at least in my mind, of like a snowy egret. They have that big thick neck and kind of a large body, but they can be very, very difficult to find. They get in the cattails and the sedges and the rushes, and they really blend in well. And those dark stripes on the pale background look like stems. And so some of you may have seen them if you come across a bittern, American bittern, and it's going about its business. It's in the marsh, and it's doing bittern things. And you come upon them, and when they feel they're detected, sometimes what they do is they very slowly raise their bill skyward, so they're pointing towards the sky. And this guy is kind of about 3/4 of the way there. And those stripes on the underparts make them very difficult to detect. And sometimes and this is true of a lot of birds with camouflage, sometimes they do it in places that may not seem the best, meaning they're out in the open and they're doing that. And it's kind of almost amusing because it's like, oh, you can't see me. It's like, yeah, you're right there. I mean, you're right on the shore. There's no vegetation around you. You need to work on your presentation a little bit because you're out in the open. But when they're in the cattails like this, they can be very difficult birds to find. So camouflage, Merriam-Webster defines it as concealment by means of disguise. So basically hiding by looking like something else, or at least not looking like a bird. And most of us know the word camouflage. Biologists will sometimes refer to the same thing as crypsis. It means the same thing. It's a little bit more fancy word, I suppose. And camouflage in birds is used for a variety of purposes. Obviously, the big one is avoiding predation. If you can, most predators, if you can hide from them, you greatly decrease your chances of being attacked, right? And so that includes not only the adults, but also the eggs and the chicks. So you want to kind of look like something that's not edible. So that's a big one. Alternatively, some birds do the sort of opposite. They're hiding from potential prey so that they have that element of surprise. Most predators are far more successful if they have the element of surprise on their side. Once they've been detected, their chances of being successful on the hunt go down dramatically. And whether you're a Cooper's hawk or a lion on the African savanna, it's the same. Once you kind of give up the goat, so to speak, your chances for a successful hunt go down. And then a third thing that birds use this for is basically to hide, not from predators, not from prey, but to these annoying little songbirds that will just ruin your day if they find you. And we typically see that in the case of camouflage anyway, we typically find that in owls. Owls are among the best camouflage birds out there, without a doubt. And their camouflage is so that the smaller birds like the wrens and the chickadees and things like that don't discover them, because then they'll mob them, a whole bunch of them. They'll give these alarm calls, and those alarm calls will attract more, and it gets a cacophony before too long. And at that point, sometimes the owls will leave and try to find a more secure spot. So different birds are using camouflage for different purposes. So we'll start off with the beginnings with the eggs. This is a pair of killdeer eggs on a beach. And you can see they're the color of the sand, and they have these dark markings on them, which make them very difficult to locate. And the adult birds, killdeer are famous for that, that broken wing display, where, and they're not the only ones that do it, but I think they're, one of the more famous examples of a bird that does that behavior. And what they'll do, it's very ingenious actually, is just say it's us, the bird perceives us as a potential predator. Well, it will sort of sneakily get off the nest a little ways, and then it makes all this noise. It's like, oh, woe is me, my poor wing is broken, and it kind of, they're trying to lure us as a potential predator away from the nest, and they're making noise. And if we kind of start to ignore them, they'll get close to us and kind of reinforce that, oh, I'm an easy target, why don't you come and get me? And then when the bird feels they're safe enough, their wing miraculously heals, and then they fly back. And then once they feel that we're gone, they'll sit on the eggs again. And what that basically means is the eggs are really difficult to find, not only because of the camouflage aspect of them, but also because the adult birds leave the nest before they go into that display. So it's hard to find the eggs. And so shorebird eggs are very well camouflaged. Shorebirds as a group don't really make a whole lot in the way of a nest. They basically, like in the case of a killdeer or a piping plover or Wilson's plover, they basically just make a little scrape in the sand, and that's going to be their nest. So the eggs have to be pretty well camouflaged. Here's a dunlin nest up in the Arctic. So dunlins are also shorebirds. They're in the sandpiper family, the Scolopacidae. And they kind of have this really cool nest where the eggs are hard to spot, and then they have a little dome almost of grasses above that, and that's to provide protection from above, such that something like a raven, for example, if it's flying, or a peregrine is flying over the tundra, it doesn't see the adult sitting on the egg, because the adults are pretty well camouflaged as well. So even though the dunlins, we won't find them on beaches in typically anywhere in the lower 48 states, but if we go up to the Arctic, their eggs are well camouflaged as well. And a lot of the birds that have ground nests tend to have fairly well marked eggs, which help them to blend in with their surroundings. So if all goes well, your eggs will hatch, and you have little fluffy balls of joy that are full of potential for the next generation. And this is a pair of killdeer that are obviously out of the egg. But if you look again, they're the color of the sand. They have these sort of diffuse dark markings on them. So if they feel they've been detected, they can kind of crouch on the sand, and they look like a rock, or they look like a rock maybe with some of that seaweed on top of them. It's very difficult to find these birds. And evolution has sort of steered them towards, if they think they've been detected, their best thing to do is freeze, because that is the easiest way for them to blend in. And that's true of a lot of birds. A lot of birds, if they're moving around, obviously they're a lot easier to see. But if that same bird were to freeze in place, they become so much harder to find. And that's true again of the chicks as well as the adults. And obviously at this stage, those chicks can't take flight yet. Once they take flight, then that offers them further protection. But until they're able to do that, which will be weeks away in the case of these two, they're relying mostly on camouflage. Maybe the parents might do the broken wing distraction display again at this stage, because they're still pretty small. But their first form of defense is to blend in and freeze. And so that's what they do. But even with that, there's, a fair number of chicks, a fair number of young don't make it to adulthood because gulls or crows or what have you might find them. And so even though the camouflage works really well, it's not 100% successful. And then again, the eggs, here in Arizona, we get a lot of hummingbird species. We don't have the buff-bellied hummingbird that Janet's got visiting her yard, 2 of them no less. But we do pretty well as far as hummingbirds. So we have things like barrel-line hummingbird and plain-capped starthroat and white-eared hummingbird and violet-crowned hummingbird, things like that. So hummingbird nests are really small. I'm sure, if you've been birding for any length of time, you've seen them before. They tend to be fairly low to the ground, within usually about 12 or 15 feet, I would say. But they don't look like a nest. They almost look like a bunch of lichen growing on a tree branch. And so, again, it's a way to avoid detection because the eggs obviously are defenseless. The chicks are defenseless for the first little few, about a week to 2 weeks, depending on the species, depending on how the weather has been. So they're quite vulnerable at that stage. So one way you can reduce that risk is to blend in. And hummingbird nests are they're basically ingenious constructions. They're made mostly of spider web, but they weave into it bits of lichens and leaves and moss and seed heads and things like that. So when you're done, the final construction doesn't look like a nest. It looks like just something that's stuck up in the tree. And so if you were a predator, you're more likely just to walk right past it and not realize there could be a couple chicks in there. So along with the owls, the nightjars, the Capra-mulgidae, that's the only family we have in North America. So the nighthawks and nightjars are really interesting family of birds. One of my favorites. Eventually, I'm going to say that every family of birds is one of my favorites because I cover a lot of ground with that subject. But the nighthawks are pretty astonishing birds. This one, so here in southern Arizona, where I am, our more common nighthawk is the lesser nighthawk. The common nighthawk is the more common one in most of North America. And so they do something, this one is not, I get it. This one's not all that camouflaged at this point. But what they'll do is instead of perching sort of across the branch, they perch like this. And so if this guy were to lower his head a bit and sort of reduce the amount of white on the throat, it could look like just a knot on the tree, and they can be difficult to see during the daytime. They're also extremely well camouflaged on the ground. In fact, some of the nighthawks will actually nest on the ground. And there's actually 2 birds here. There's an adult, and in front of the adult, there's a almost fully grown chick in front. So with nighthawks, I used to live in the Bahamas. I lived in the Bahamas for 8 years before I moved to Arizona. And down there, we have the Antillean nighthawk. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Antillean, the common, the lesser, you can almost step on them before they move. And then it kind of scares the daylights out of you because you didn't think there was anything there. But our eyes are really good at detecting patterns, and our brains are very good at interpreting those patterns. That is how one of the reasons we were able to survive. But the camouflage is so well done that sometimes, even if you're looking for them, you don't see them. But if you see your first one, your brain kind of gets this search image, and you can start to find more of them because now your eyes and brain are kind of looking for something that they're familiar with. But again, they sit on the ground, they nest on the ground. The eggs are very well camouflaged, the adults and the chicks. So these birds take camouflage all the way throughout their life cycle. The common paraque, maybe you've been to South Texas or further south. This is a species that's kind of a South Texas specialty, but I'm using this as an example. I could have used the Eastern whippoorwill. I could have used the Chuck's Will's widow. I could have used the Mexican whippoorwill. I could have used the common poorwill. It doesn't really matter because they're all of these birds are essentially doing the same thing, not only in North America, but throughout the world. They're extremely well camouflaged. They're extremely cryptic. They sit on the ground amongst all the leaves, and they're very difficult to spot. So, even though this is not an eastern whippoorwill, it's, the eastern whippoorwills are kind of doing the same thing as this bird does. And usually, as in owls, we usually detect them by their vocalizations, usually at dusk or after dusk. Finding these birds during the daytime can be really challenging. You have to spend a lot of time in the right habitat, very carefully looking, very, sort of stealthily walking. And eventually, your persistence will be paid off with a really good view, because the other thing about camouflage is it really helps you blend in. However, if you start to move, your camouflage is shot at that point. So it works really well until you move. And what that means from a birding standpoint is sometimes you can get very close to these birds, and because they don't want to, they think they're invisible, essentially, is what it comes down to. And so they don't want to move until the last possible second, when maybe I'm not invisible, maybe this thing does see me, and then they'll move out of the way. But if you spend enough time in the right habitat, like if you're out in the evening and you're hearing them, well, go back the next day, because they're probably fairly close to where you were hearing them in the evening. They're going to be more than likely on the ground, except again, the nighthawks do occasionally perch on branches, but they're usually pretty low. But that's the best way to find nightjars if you want to find them during the daytime. Sparrows. Now, I looked at the society's website, and I applaud all of you for doing like beginning birding. I think that's the classes, fantastic. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I wish you all the best with that. And because I do classes too, I do birding classes. We do young birders. We do birdability walks for people with disabilities. And one of the classes and workshops I do is sparrow ID. And usually when I say, okay, we're going to talk about sparrows, the eyes glaze over or the eyes roll in the back of their head, and people are just like, oh, sparrows. Sparrows should not, in theory, sparrows should not be difficult to identify. The reason being is, compared to things like gulls or female and immature hummingbirds or tyrant flycatchers or other notoriously difficult groups of birds, sparrows aren't like that at all. Most sparrows are readily identifiable. The problem is we don't get good looks at them. They're in thickets, they're in the grasses, they're in the marsh. So they're hard to get good looks at. One of the reasons why they're hard to get good looks at is most sparrows, not all, but most sparrows are kind of brownish, streaky birds. Well, those streaks help to break out their outline. And this is the case now. This Lincoln sparrow, it's a sparrow I'm sure you get along the Gulf Coast in the wintertime. We get them here quite commonly in the winter as well. They're easy birds to identify if you can see them. But if they're in the thickets, if they're in the grasses and they're not moving, they can really blend in very well. And I think that's the main obstacle, if you will, of sparrow identification, is getting good looks at them. Here's another one, the Vesper sparrow. Now, I know eastern vespers have been declining pretty precipitously for the last, several decades. The western populations are in comparison, are doing much better population-wise. But again, small bird, brownish on the ground, the streaks kind of blend in. The streaks look like a stick, and then the white or the whitish between the streaks look like, the air or gaps between the sticks. So again, they blend in really well. And some of them, like some of the sparrows that you see more often than we do, like Henslow sparrows and salt marsh sparrows and that whole group, those birds are very difficult to find. They stay in the thick grasses and they blend in really well in there. And so there's a reason why those birds are highly sought after by a lot of birders, because they're difficult to see. The Vesper is not nearly as challenging as those birds to get a good look at, but they're still very well camouflaged. Now I have to sort of play a home field card here. We get, we have a lot of birds in southern Arizona that are essentially of Western Mexican distribution that just come into the United States, maybe in southern Arizona or southwestern New Mexico. And one of them is the elegant trogon. Now, if you've seen a trogon in a field guide, but not seen the bird in the field, you'll say, well, this thing must be easy as pie to find. It's big, it's got a bright yellow bill, it's got a brilliant red belly, it's got an orange eye-ring, it's bright green, the thing's about a foot long. How hard can it be? Well, it's surprisingly difficult because, as is the case in this bird, they tend to not rest or perch up on the tops of the trees. They rest in the lower canopy or the sub canopy, which is clothed in shade. So those bright colors have this tendency to disappear. And if you look at if you do see one, for example, and all you're seeing is the back is kind of a bluish green overall, and sometimes with the various shades of green out in the forest, it can be hard to spot them even that way. The third thing that makes them difficult is their tropical origins. And so I think they have quite a bit of the whole idea of mañana going on, meaning, it's like they're perched in a tree, they're sitting there for hours on end, and yeah, they could fly to the next sycamore tree, but they seem to be pretty confident that sycamore tree will be there tomorrow, and maybe I'll fly over there tomorrow instead of today. So they don't move around a whole lot. They have a very distinctive song. It kind of sounds like a dog with a sore throat. So they're often, like with owls, they're often detected by their voice, but they're easy to overlook, even though if you look at them against the white of like the National Geographic Field Guide or the Sibley Guide or the Peterson Guide, you say, oh, this thing should be easy. Well, if you ever come to southern Arizona and you're here during, a few of them do overwinter, but we should start to see them becoming more obvious and more vocal in the next few weeks. But it's not an uncommon thing. And Janet might have an experience with this, having spent some time here, where people will say, oh, I'm looking for a trogon. Have you seen them? Oh, no, it was just here, but it flew away. And then you just want to kind of punch them right in the head. But they're hard birds to find, even though it looks like they should be easy. So this is the male. This is the female. The female is much browner overall. The belly on her is more pinkish than red, not nearly as bright. She's got the yellow bill, but she's kind of got this white, what we call the teardrop, coming down behind her eye. And, she's even more camouflaged than he is because she's in those earthy tones. And as is typical of many, many birds, the females tend to be more cryptic than the males are. And again, it seems like they should be really easy, but they're surprisingly challenging. And, the camouflage is not only their pattern, but also their behavior. They don't move around a lot. Sometimes they'll actually move around quite a bit. Lucky are you if you're in the area when that happens, but a lot of times they just sit there. And you could literally walk right under one. It's, 15, 20 feet above your head and not see it, even though it looks like that should not happen. Another bird that's the case is the Montezuma quail. This bird is bananas. And you look at it and you say, well, how in the world has this thing survived? Well, they're in the same family as northern bobwhite, the New World quail. And first of all, this bird has passed, in my opinion, the elegant trogon for the bird that visiting birders most want to see. Because even though numerically there are more Montezuma quail than there are trogons in southern Arizona, trogons are easier to find. Even though they're not as easy as you might think, they're easier to find than this bird is. And the reason is, quail are, as you're walking along, these are birds kind of oak grasslands, pine oak woodlands. So they're kind of medium elevation birds. They're not in the desert floor and they're not up at the higher peaks. They're in between. And as you're walking along, there might be Montezuma quail, but most of us, no matter how quiet we're trying to be, actually make a fair amount of noise. And so the quail that were there hear us coming and then they leave. On the other hand, sometimes you can get very close to them. And then they just kind of crouch down and they don't move. And those pale streaks on the back look like grass stems, like old dead grass stems. And I've been within 5 feet of these with a group of people, and they were behind a grass tussock, and people cannot find them. I'm like, they're right over there. They're right there. And they can't find them. So to give you an example, here's an example. This is up in the oak woodlands. There's actually 2 quail in this photo. One is kind of obvious. It's right in the center. You can see a little bit of the head. Kind of, if you see that stick right in the center, if you follow that stick towards the background, it's kind of pointing right at its head. So if you can see my cursor, here's his head. Here's the back. Okay, that's the easy one. The other one's over here. You can see a little bit of the back right here. Those spots are right here. And so this is a bird that you don't go looking for. It finds you. If you've paid proper tribute to the birding gods, they may reward you with a good look at these birds. But these are even though numerically there's a lot more Montezuma quail than there are trogons, these birds are far harder to find. And usually how we find them is driving roads and quiet roads that go through appropriate habitat, and sometimes you'll see them crossing the road. That's one of the best ways to find them. So again, it's a bird you look in the field guide, looks like it should be really obvious. It's not. It can be a very difficult bird to find. Some of the pheasant family, the ptarmigan, the grouse, that whole group are another group of birds that are very well camouflaged. Now, this is a white-tailed ptarmigan up in the northern Rockies, and you can see the back pattern looks very much like the rocks in the background. And again, trying really hard not to be visible. Ptarmigan are interesting birds because they actually have 3 molts a year instead of the usual 1. Some birds, like warblers, have a second molt, usually in late winter, early spring, and that's when they get, Peterson calls them the confusing fall warblers because they've molted out of their really distinctive breeding plumage. But the birds in that plumage will then molt into the breeding plumage, or the alternate plumage, as it's also called. So that's when your black-polled warbler or chestnut-sided warbler become really easy to identify. Whereas in the winter, those birds are fall, I guess, because they winter further south. But fall, those birds look a lot more alike. Ptarmigan go through 3 molts because their habitat is constantly changing. The 3 species of ptarmigan are either Arctic tundra or alpine tundra. And these are places where there could be snow at any month of the year, any day of the year. On the other hand, they can, if you were a white bird in this sort of environment, you'd really stand out. So they're almost constantly changing their appearance. And they're changing that to blend in so that things like gyrfalcons can't find them. Arctic foxes can't find them. That same bird, white-tailed ptarmigan, looks like this in the wintertime. They're amongst the hardiest birds in the world. They stay up in the Arctic. They stay at high elevations. As long as they're food, they'll stay up high. And if these 3 birds were to turn away from us and we couldn't see their eye or their bill, they'd look like a mound of snow, and that's what they would look at. So again, very well camouflaged. So rails I did a presentation, I think Janet was there last night, on rails. Rails are another one of my favorite groups of birds. And so these are also, just like the American bittern, tend to be birds of marshes, freshwater, brackish, saltwater, and they can really blend in. And so here we see the Sora. I don't know, hopefully you've noticed the yellow rail behind it. So if you go to the left of the Sora, there's a yellow rail sitting right out in the open, which is a thing that doesn't happen all that often. Yellow rails are a bird that can be pretty difficult to see well. Soras are a bit easier. But again, they're colored and they're patterned to look like the vegetation that they're usually found in. Rails are really interesting birds. I mean, they can be really difficult to find, to see well, but then sometimes they come out in the open and I swear they think they're invisible. They're just out there, you're hearing Soras in the marsh, that they're there. can't find them, can't find them. And then you walk, and all of a sudden, one's out along the shoreline, maybe swimming across a patch of open water, and they're acting like we can't see them. And then, if you get that chance, take advantage of it, because at some point something is going to spook them and they're going to run back into the reeds, and your opportunity is over at that point. But rails, just like the nightjars, just like owls, are really difficult, except for the coots. Coots are pretty easy, but the other most typical rails are difficult to get a good look at. So again, there's a sora in the front, and then to the left of the sora, there's an adult yellow rail in there. And I didn't put the caption in there because I didn't want to give it away. Okay, hopefully you can see him. He's right here. There's his head. There's his bill, eye, and there's that yellowish coloration. Not really yellow, yellowish, my buffish, something like that. We're not very good at naming birds. The brown creeper, this is a widespread bird throughout most of North America, very well camouflaged against tree trunks. In fact, I have no doubt that brown creepers are a lot more common than a lot of people think, based on how often they see them. I just think they're very cryptic. They also will kind of sidle around to the other side of the tree, so we can't see them as easily. But they're it's a bird that I don't think many people associate necessarily with camouflage, but is actually one of our most camouflaged songbirds. The common potu, this is a bird doing its impression of a stump. They're tropical. There's several species of potu. They're in the Caribbean. They're from southern Mexico down throughout South America. And this is a bird that most people find them by having a local point them out. Because again, we don't have any of these in North America, and you might do a lot of homework before you make a trip to the range of the common potu, and the potu might be probably would be on your list of things you expected or hoped to see, and you could look right at one and not see them. They're absolutely bonkers until they open their eyes. They have big yellow eyes that kind of bulge out of their head. But if you're, and these are nocturnal birds, they belong to the same order as our nighthawks and nightjars do. And if you were trying to blend in during the daytime, being a nocturnal bird, one really good way to do that is to close your eyes so that those big lemon yellow eyes don't stand out and give you away. So they sit there, their eyes are just barely slits, so they can still see. If a predator somehow were to detect them, they can take evasive action if they need to, but they'll just sit out there, which is kind of remarkable, because where they live, it's the tropics, and there's that tropical sun beating down on them all day, and they don't flinch. They're like mannequins. They just sit there, and they're able to not overheat. They're able to remain hidden, and then the sun sets, and then they go about finding food. So I think the potus are some of the best camouflage artists of any North America or any bird in the world, period. Owls are right up there as well. Owls are so the birds we've talked about pretty much so far, it's largely to avoid predation. This guy is more to, the owls in general are more to avoid being found by songbirds that would mob them, again, chickadees, wrens, that nuthatches, that sort of group, but also to hide from prey. So if you're a great gray owl, there's not a lot out there in your northern forest that's going to mess with you. But you don't want to get harassed all day by those insolent little songbirds. So you try to blend in, and this bird's like 2 feet long. I mean, they're big birds, and yet their coloring is such, and where they perch is such that I'm sure many people walk right by great gray owls all the time and just don't see them because they're so well camouflaged. Also, if they're sitting there, if we're not seeing them, there's a fair chance that other things aren't seeing them either, like maybe ground squirrels during the summer, or tree squirrels or red squirrels. And so they're sitting there blending in, and oh, there's a squirrel. I have to feed my nestlings, so I'll go out and grab them because the squirrel didn't see them coming, and that's because they blend in so well. This is a friend of mine took this photo. We get long-eared owls in small numbers every winter. They're sort of specialists. They like to roost in like these wooded thickets like this, but then they like to hunt in open areas. So they like this mosaic of habitats where they have nice roosting sites right next to either grasslands, agricultural fields, marshes, something like that. And so they're kind of habitat specialists in a way, even though it's a specialty on two different habitats. They just have to be close together. So that is a long-eared owl was wintering here in southern Arizona a couple of years ago. So now we're gonna play the find the bird game. We're gonna start off kind of easy and work towards more difficult ones. So this is, I'll give you, if you don't see him, I'll give you a hint. It's an American woodcock, which is this bizarre shorebird that likes to live in moist woodlands. It's kind of said, I don't need no stinking shoreline. I'm going to go live in the woods. And that's what they've done. They're related to snipe, if you're familiar with Wilson snipe, and also a little bit further removed from the dowitchers, long-billed and short-billed dowitchers. So they kind of have that look to them, but they live in a completely different habitat, and they tend to have these really sort of interesting nocturnal flight displays. So your American woodcock is right here in the middle. Here's his eye, here's his bill pointing down, if you can see my cursor. If you can't see my cursor, look for that slanting branch in the middle of the picture and look right behind it. He's kind of out in the sunshine. And so, again, if you're out in the woodland, you could easily walk within 5 feet of this bird and not see it, because it's gonna, again, they're believers in their camouflage, so they're not necessarily gonna, fly off. So there's actually 2 birds in this photo. I'll give everybody a minute to look. This one's, I don't know, this one's kind of easy too, I think. But if you look in the bottom right, there are 2 willow ptarmigan there. You can see the eyes and the bill. And again, I mean, I've lived in warm enough climates for the last 30 plus years of my life that going to see a ptarmigan in the winter doesn't really appeal to me too much, but they're extremely well camouflaged. And so again, there's 2 in the bottom right corner, both of them facing to the left. What else do we have? Okay, so this is a parrot. There's a parrot in this photo. It's a rose-ringed parakeet. As you know, parrots are mostly green, many of them, and so they blend in pretty easily in the foliage. Which they also usually in flocks. That's if you've spent any time in the tropics, you'll hear this basically this cacophony of noise, and that's a flock of parrots flying overhead. But when they're perched and quiet, they actually they disappear into the vegetation, and that's where that green coloration really comes in handy. And I'm sure that there's something like a female painted bunting is very green as well, and I'm sure the green is to help her blend in. Some of the vireos are very green. Some of the warblers have a fair amount of green on them at certain times of the year, and those are all adaptations to help them blend in. So here's his eye right here. Here's his bill. His tail tip is down here. And so again, the tricky thing for a parrot though is to be quiet. They tend to make a fair amount of noise. And so, if this was a field situation, we might very well be hearing them. But even if if you're on the ground, even if there's one way up in that tree, they could be hard to find because of their coloration. So here's more owls. These are long-eared owls again. And I'll say that there's 3 of them in the picture, at least. And that's another thing that happens a lot with long-eared owls. They tend to roost in groups. So if you find one, at least during the wintertime, if you find one, if you look closely in that same area, you might find others as well. sometimes the roosts can be, a dozen or more, but there's 3 in this one. And they kind of form a diagonal line from sort of bottom left to top right. So we have one right here. This is the easiest one, I think, to find because it's kind of silhouetted against the sky. There's one right in the middle, and there's one to the right of that one. So 1, 2, 3. They really blend in well. I don't know how everybody's doing on these quizzes. Hopefully you're doing pretty well. Otherwise you're like, yeah, I found those 3 in the first 5 seconds, you moron. Why are we still talking about this photo? But now this next one is more challenging, I think. And so there is a bird in it. I'll say that. And the bird is not small. This is where we should play that Final Jeopardy music. It's a close relative of the long-eared owl. It's the short-eared owl. A bird of grasslands, marshes, can be really hard to spot because they're kind of straw yellow in color with darker streaks on them. And we typically find them most often around dusk because unlike the long-eared owl, short-eared owls tend to roost on the ground. They just blend in really well on the ground. So very, sort of a different approach to remaining hidden than the long-eared owls would have. If you're ever somewhere where you see northern harriers, which are these beautiful hawks with long tails and long wings and white rumps and a facial disc like an owl has, if you're seeing northern harriers during the daytime, it's quite possible there's short-eared owls there at night. So if you went back around dusk, you might see them. Anyway, the owl is right in the middle, right here. It's his head. He's got 1 eye, 2 eye. Here's kind of the facial disc over here. And so, again, owls are the masters of camouflage, but it's not. One of the primary reasons they do it is to avoid getting mobbed by smaller birds. These birds are probably, the short-eared owls are probably also doing it to avoid predation from something like a coyote, because coyotes can be active day or night. And if you're a short-eared owl and you're sitting in the grasslands, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. So it kind of, not only will it keep maybe the sparrows from mobbing you because there's not a lot of wrens. Marsh wren, sedge wren can be in places where if these owls are near a marsh, but in the grasslands, there's not too many wrens in grasslands. There's not too many chickadees in grasslands. So it's going to be more like the grassland sparrows or something like that. But they're also, not only are they trying to avoid detection by those smaller birds, they're also trying to avoid detection from potential predators like coyotes, for example. Harriers won't mess with them. Golden eagles would take them if they had the chance. Bald eagles would take them if they had a chance. But so that is a very brief introduction into camouflage in birds. I'll stop sharing my screen. I didn't want to go, I have this tendency, as Janet's probably aware, I have a tendency to talk too much. So I tried to keep it short and sweet and not talk too much, but I went too long, I think. But anyway, if you have any questions about anything, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Yeah. No questions.
No questions, just very fascinating.
Yeah, well done. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
I don't have any questions, but that was a fabulous presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you for being a member of the Francis M. Weston Audubon Society. That's fantastic.
Thanks for another good talk.
Yeah.